So, Ambassador Scheer and Admiral Swift, thank you so much for joining us here at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us about a lot of really critical issues that have been discussed. So I guess I'd like to start off with a topic, the new Japanese defense program guidelines that were presented in October 2018. I wonder, from the US side, how were these proposed guidelines received?
I think the new guidelines were received very positively in the United States. Of course, the United States and Japan have a long tradition of cooperation as allies, and we coordinate very closely both on our requirements as allies and on the ways in which we need to fulfill those requirements. So the new National Defense Program outline, I think, reflects not only strong Japanese interests, but it reflects the coordination we've conducted as allies. So the reception was very positive, and I'm sure the U.S. side looks forward to cooperating with Japan in as it implements the guidelines and as we strengthen our alliance cooperation on the basis of those guidelines.
I would tag off Ambassador Scheer's comments. I think there'll be a number of opportunities created with the release of the guidelines to deepen the dialogue. I don't think the questions will be new. The questions, I think, in the circles that I've been in, both in uniform and out of uniform, they've always been a part of those discussions. But I think having the new defense policy guidelines out there brings those questions to the fore, so they're more broadly discussed. So the guidelines themselves, I think, call them out. It talks about, obviously, the relationships internal to Japan from a defense perspective. It talks about the new domains that Japan is interested in being engaged in. It talks about jointness, amongst other things. Those are all questions that the U.S. side has been asking itself as well. So it allows a more collaborative discussion on those issues that are common separately, but allows a collaborative discussion of them together. What does it do with both of our relationships? And I think the environment in the region has changed so significantly in the last 5 years, in the last 2 years, and the last year. From the Japanese side, I think that was a large driver to the drafting of the guidelines, and I think that's very useful to both Japan and the United States and to the region as well.
Were there any kind of striking elements from the guidelines that, from your perspective, were either new or kind of delved beyond the cooperation that has gone on between the U.S. and Japan?
Well, I think the addition of space and cyber is very important, as well as the overall emphasis on multi-domain coordination in warfare. These are areas that the United States military and the United States defense and security community are focusing on very heavily. And as we go forward, the Japanese focus on these areas will certainly help us coordinate more closely and operate more closely together as allies. Space and cyber are going to be critical domains in which we fight the next war. And I think it's a sign of great progress that Japan has placed emphasis as strong as it has on these domains.
If I could add, walking a little bit in Ambassador Scheer's lane here, I think it's important to note the role that the national security, the NSC, participated in drafting the guidelines. It does represent really a whole of government. I think the process of drafting the guidelines was a whole of government process on the Japanese side, which I think is instructive to everyone I know.
Obviously, no plan can cover everything. Were there any gaps that you saw that you wish had been addressed, or anything that you were kind of not even necessarily disappointed, but something you wish you had saw more or more comprehensively addressed?
Well, I think one thing both the United States and Japan are going to have to focus on in future years is the resourcing question. We're both facing some fiscal stringency in future years. That's going to generate shortages in defense spending, I think, on both sides. And as we move forward in implementing our defense plans together, we're going to have to make sure that our resources and our goals and the tools we have to pursue our goals are all aligned in a more tight fiscal environment.
As the ambassador pointed out, the resourcing issues are not unique to any one country. And the challenges that we face on the defense side as well as the other areas of government that investments need to be made. We don't have the people, we don't have the assets, whether you're talking about on the diplomatic side, on the military side, the economic side, whatever it may be. The guidelines help structure that dialogue in a more positive way, because the discussions I've been in, they're kind of all over the place as to what the challenges are, because there's so many challenges.
Well, I think our discussions yesterday, as well as the NDP, was generated by three big issues in the region, and that's uncertainties related to China's rise and China's intentions, uncertainties related to the role of the United States in the world and in the region, and uncertainties, of course, related to Kim Jong-un's development of nuclear weapons and the missiles designed to deliver them. So while we may have differences in more tactical areas, we're all facing these uncertainties. And as allies, we've always worked together to reconcile our differences and move forward operationally based on common understanding.
I was not surprised at the amount of overlap, the consensus of what the challenges that the region faces. In this case, it's in the context of the Japanese perspective of what those challenges are and the U.S. perspective. The guidelines allows a focus on how do we collaborate in those areas where there's overlap, but it also allows a discussion where we have differences to better understand those differences. The U.S. is going to have different national interests than other countries in the region. And too oftentimes, those points have been points of divergence, frictional points of divergence. I think that the guidelines allow us to have a discussion of where those friction points are and have a deeper understanding about why we see things differently. That actually further strengthens the relationship, gets away from those divergent discussions that sometimes have occurred in the past.
The Admiral makes a good point. I mean, what the U.S. and Japan do together as allies is not the result of one side imposing its views on the other, but it's always a result of very close cooperation, coordination, and consultation. So what we do as allies is really a joint effort.
Another kind of proposal that came out of the Japan side was this concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was proposed by Prime Minister Abe, and is more or less taken up by the current Trump administration as kind of a central theme. But I think you, Ambassador Scheer, brought up one of the kind of difficulties and challenges is questions of commitment from the U.S. side and uncertainty about kind of follow through regarding these problems that require multilateral cooperation or larger efforts. Do you think it's justified for your partners in Asia to be concerned about U.S. commitment? And could you discuss kind of what you see as the Trump administration's commitment to these challenges in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think regardless of questions of commitment, it's pretty clear that both the United States and Japan share a pretty broad agreement on strategic challenges in the region, and that's why we both embraced a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So, we'll face uncertainties about the level of American commitment as a result of what's going on in Washington. But out here in the Western Pacific, we're still working together very closely. And the United States, over the longer term, is going to remain committed to this region.
I would agree. I do think it's important. I think it's less of a debate about the relevancy of uncertainty. I go back to my experiences in 2011 and 2012 as a 7th Fleet Commander, and about halfway through the tour, the U.S. Position of the rebalance, the refocus on Asia was rolled out. And in my travels throughout the region, there was a consensus view that was shared privately with me, with senior people in governments throughout the region, that skepticism of would the U.S. be able to stay focused on this rebalance. And then I left after my tour as a 7th Fleet Commander. I went back to D.C. for just a little over a year and came back as a Pacific Fleet Commander. And many of those same leaders, as you can imagine, were still in the area of my responsibility. And they were some of the first ones that I went and visited. And privately, the discussion was, "We told you so." And it was, so this is the reality of the ebb and flow from a political perspective of U.S. policy and the application of that policy. I think the relationship that we enjoy between Japan and the United States for my 40 years in the Navy, and it's continued now in my life in academia, I'm confident that these storms that we face from time to time will make us stronger as we work our way through them.
I think it's important to note that one of the more certain elements in the region is the fact that Japan has stepped up and assumed a much greater leadership role in the region. And it's done this through the negotiation of the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. It has done this through increasing its funding for infrastructure projects throughout Southeast Asia, for example. And it's done this through a very vigorous diplomatic efforts by the Prime Minister. So Japan's role in the region has increased. It has taken on more leadership, and this has certainly helped compensate us for some of the uncertainties associated with both China's rise and the uncertainties related to America's role in the region.
I'd kind of like to pivot slightly to kind of one of the perhaps primary challenges in the region, which of course I think has come up often in discussions, which is issues with China and its increasing efforts to kind of assert itself in the region and also on the world stage as a major power. And so I know kind of one microcosm of that kind of stepping into the world is happening in the South China Sea, which of course you both are very familiar with. And speaking of the pivot to Asia in the Obama administration, there was kind of a political and rhetorical shift saying we will focus our assets and focus our attention to this region. Whether there was follow through on that, I think we could have that debate as well. But I wonder what is happening right now under the Trump administration regarding issues in the South China Sea?
So one of the criticisms of the previous administration was that policy was put in place, but opportunities for action was missed. And I think what we've seen in the current administration is certainly actions have been taken, but a criticism would be with a lack of understanding of the policy behind it and what the ultimate strategic objective was. And I'll use two examples. One is the increase of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. I'm a supporter of freedom of navigation from a global perspective. I think it does provide value of reinforcing the current rules-based system, but equally important, reinforcing the fact that if people disagree with the current rules-based system, there's mechanisms by which to change those rules through diplomacy and dialogue. So from a policy perspective, we lose sight too often of the fact that the freedom of navigation operations are meant as a trigger, a demonstration of where the U.S. thinks there's a divergence from in this case, UNCLOS, the International Rules-Based Order, but it's for the State Department to make that case with the country that is involved. The second point I would make is some of the actions that this administration has taken that not just with the previous administration, but before that, was close to those lines that diplomatically there was reluctance to cross. Trade sanctions, there's a broad discussion about the value of trade sanctions, but just the fact that we've undertaken them, and there hasn't been this incredible revolt or response from other countries about using them as a tool. I think some of the outreach that this administration has done to other leaders around the world that kind of raised eyebrows. It wasn't part of the conventional diplomatic approach. But anytime there's dialogue, I think that's important. So those are some examples that I would use that this administration should. I think it has expanded the dialogue in an important way and demonstrated there are opportunities out there for the United States to act to increase stability, where in the past it was felt those activities would actually decrease stability in the region.
Well, we're all certainly concerned about China's rise. We're concerned about the increased Chinese assertiveness and increased Chinese military power and military operations in places like the South China Sea. But it's important to note that both Japan and the United States have very, very strong economic relationships with China, as well as very strong people-to-people relationships with China. And despite the fact that we may get more competitive with the Chinese, those other relationships are going to continue, and they're going to provide some ballast on the relationship, I think, that will continue to contribute to stability. Another important point is that despite all of the important attention given to the military aspects of our competition, our approach to China, both Japan's and the United States, is primarily diplomatic. Neither side wants to go to war with China, and the likelihood of war with China is very low right now. I think the Chinese don't want to go to war with us either. So in the absence of war, we're going to be relying on diplomacy, and the primary use of military forces in situations like this is to back our diplomacy. So what we're doing with our Japanese ally is not just preparing for war, which we both think is unlikely, but using the tools we have to strengthen our diplomacy, to strengthen our leverage vis-a-vis China, and to increase our cooperation together.
I do want to ask, because point taken, of course, that diplomacy is a primary outreach. I guess if history is any lesson in the case of China's actions in the South China Sea, they've continued to build up these islands, even despite saying we won't militarize these features. There has been evidence that they have militarized and put military assets on those features. And so I wonder what is the diplomatic strategy to contend with this if the strategy up until now has not really had the payoff or the meaningful impact that you might have hoped?
Well, I think our military operations in the South China Sea are important. I think it's important that we continue to cast light on Chinese activities that violate international law, but it's also important that we use developments in the South China Sea to strengthen our alliances and partnerships with others. And Japan has been much more active in the South China Sea, both militarily and diplomatically, and that has strengthened. That's been what we call a force multiplier. It has really strengthened our diplomacy in the South China Sea. The attention the United States needs to place on the region has fallen off a little in the Trump administration, but I think that as the administration recognizes the importance of conducting strong diplomacy vis-a-vis China and the importance of Southeast Asia, that attention will increase.
If I could add to, my personal view is that the national box of tools is extensive that any nation has access to. And I think that whenever we reach for a military tool, it should always be in support of another element of government. If you reach for the military tool and that's your primary tool, it is often a statement that diplomacy has failed or we've given up on diplomacy. If you reach for a military tool, one of the reasons that I think that there has been a tendency in the past and still in the future, it should be instructive to us, that the reason that people reach for that tool, leaders do, is that the response is measurable almost immediately. The challenge that the ambassador has with all of his service to the country and his role in State Department and then continued in OSD as well, is that the diplomatic tools, the policy tools, the political tools, the response is a very slow turn cycle.
What, from the U.S. perspective, would be the ideal outcome? Like, what is the objective of current U.S. actions?
What I would suggest to my Chinese friends is that it's in China's best interest to either embrace the standing rules-based system or to advocate for changes in the system where they have differences through diplomacy and dialogue rather than force and coercion. Personally, I don't think China has any intention of attacking anyone. That would certainly be counterproductive to both the future of China and the other countries, just from an economic perspective, much less from a military perspective. So I think the realm is really in the diplomacy side where these dialogues need to occur, and the military actions should always be in direct support of engendering a deepening of that dialogue, not just directly between the U.S. and China, but between China and other countries in the region that have similar concerns. But I defer to the ambassador for his expertise.
Thanks, Admiral. Well, in 2016, the International Tribunal on the South China Sea defined what's legal and what's not in the South China Sea with regard to territorial claims. And I think it'd be great for the Chinese to adhere to the tribunal's ruling. If the Chinese adhered to that ruling, I think a lot of problems would disappear. And I think that's the case with the other claimants as well. The Chinese aren't the only people occupying features in the Spratly Islands. There are other ASEAN claimants who occupy features, and I think the best first step for everybody would be to adhere to the International Tribunal ruling.
This is kind of a very big picture question, but does the U.S. have a grand strategy in the region?
My view is, and there's many people that disagree, is that the United States does not have a grand strategy. I think we had a grand strategy with respect to Russia, but with the fall of the Soviet Union and the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, I think we went through a period of stability where we lost our way on how to go about building a grand strategy. But clearly great power competition is back, I think in a big way. I think there's a lack of understanding of exactly what a grand strategy is. In my mind, it's simply a nation's statement of what it sees that is important from a global perspective and what it sees as its role based on those important issues. And then from that grand strategy, you develop regional strategies. And what I've seen in my experience in the Navy and then now outside in civil sector and in academia is this uncertainty of others and of the U.S. exactly what is our strategy. People ask me on a regular basis, what is the U.S. strategy with respect to the South China Sea? What's the U.S. strategy with respect to the East China Sea, with the Mediterranean, with specific countries? And I think Japan has set an example with the guidelines of the importance of a strategy. I do believe that Japan does have a strategy, and that allows a whole of government approach to get after this problem as opposed to just military elements or just the Department of Treasury with sanctions, whatever it may be. It should be a much more collaborative effort.
I think the administration, the Trump administration, would say that yes, we do have a grand strategy, and you can read about it in the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy. And I think those two strategies do pretty well in terms of defining what the problem is, and the problem is great power competition. And they do well in defining a set of goals. But I think one of the problems associated with the national security strategy is we're not quite sure that the president adheres to it. We're not quite sure what the president believes in this regard. I've never heard him mention the words national security strategy. I've only heard him mention the words Indo-Pacific strategy once in his speech in Da Nang in 2017 to the APEC forum. What the president believes is one issue related to the national security strategy. Another issue is implementation. We're not quite sure exactly what the administration is doing to implement the strategy at the operational and tactical levels, both diplomatically and militarily. So that's created some confusion. There have been some good signs, however, and in this regard, Congress has really stepped in to help fill things out with what's known as the BUILD Act on infrastructure funding, as well as the Asia Reassurance Initiative, which is a completely senatorial initiative. And these are very encouraging, and hopefully the administration will get together with Congress and put these elements together and build what turns out to be a coherent strategy.